Welcome to What's the Deal by Bluegrass Realtors, your go-to source for the latest housing trends, market insights, and industry updates from the heart of the Bluegrass region. Whether you're buying, selling, or just curious about the market, we're here to help keep you informed with all the info you need to make confident real estate decisions. Hey everyone, and welcome to the What's the Deal podcast. This month we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Jessica Lautz from the National Association of REALTORS. She is the Deputy Chief Economist and Vice President of Research, and she's been with NAR since 2007. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers, and she's been recognized by Housing Wire's Women of Influence and Riz Media's Newsmaker Award. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lautz.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be with you today.
Yes, thanks for being here. So let's just kind of jump right in. Can you walk us through some of the latest NAR data on existing home sales? Like, what are some of the trends you're seeing recently?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because if we look at the actual home sales volume, so the number of homes that are being sold in the US right now, it's pretty sluggish. It's about 4 million. That is less than what we would see pre-pandemic. So pre-pandemic, we would be closer to 5 million. So, and this has been true. It's been true in 2023. It was true in 2024. It's been true the first half of the year. At the exact same time, though, home prices keep hitting an all-time high. So there's plenty of people out there who want to buy homes, but we know that housing affordability is one of those factors that's holding back folks from the market.
Yeah, that's definitely a big problem. And I know a lot of realtors are, frankly, their wallets are hurting a little bit. The last 2 years is two of the worst years we've seen in a long time. Are we kind of trending for a repeat of the last two, or are we any better, any worse?
Well, we are hoping that this year will be better, and there's a big reason why, and it's that we're getting more inventory into the market. People are making moves. We know the lock-in effect of low interest rate mortgages is true, that there's lots of people who say, no, I'm locked in a subpar 4%. I'm not going to move right now because of that. But life changes happen. You can't necessarily time a new baby, right? Or a
Right.
marriage or a divorce. Or I want to be across the country to be close to the grandkids. You can't time those things to mortgage interest rates. And so we're starting to see some movement. And certainly homeowners are sitting on so much housing equity that maybe that lock-in effect is suddenly starting to free. So we're starting to see that movement. The other thing is we really need mortgage interest rates to lower. They've been in the mid sixes for 20 straight weeks. So if we saw any movement in that, that would be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's always something that realtors take a watch very closely for sure is those interest rates. But I think a lot of our last guest we talked a lot about economic uncertainty and how that's affecting mortgage rates right now. So I don't know if we're gonna see much movement, at least not what we'd like to see.
Yeah, when we look at mortgage interest rates, we certainly do need that movement. We also need people to feel secure, right? Like you're making the biggest financial transaction of your lifetime. You want to feel on really secure footing. And maybe that means that you have a solid job, but also do your neighbors, does your community around you, so that as you move into this transaction, there's no anxiety aside from the normal anxiety of making this large purchase. And so having that feeling of security really does help the housing market as well.
Yeah, that's really good. And then, so let's kind of stick around with the mortgage rates for a bit here. Um, so the mortgage rates, they're hovering around that like high, the sevens and eights really. And then combining that with home prices, like how has that affected affordability? What are we seeing there?
Yeah, that's the really difficult thing, especially for first-time home buyers. And we know that first-time home buyers don't have housing equity to move into the market. And so they really have to come up with a down payment that is going to get them over that hump of looking at higher mortgage rates and also looking at higher home prices. And that's really the big hurdle that we're seeing here is for those young adults really trying to get into the market. If we had any loosening of mortgage interest rates, that's where we would see a more affordable housing market for these young adults because home prices are expected to keep climbing.
Yeah, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best is today. That kind of applies for real estate too, right? Maybe not
Unfortunately
20
for
years
these,
actually.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if they were able to get into the market when they were teenagers, that would be helpful, but that's not actually going to happen, right? So this is quite difficult for young adults today.
Yeah, and let's kind of stick around that first time buyers. So, I mean, I saw a stat recently that first time buyers are just 24% of the market, which is the lowest
Mhm.
share in quite a while. So
Yeah.
talk more on that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So It's just 24% of the market. And I think to put that into context, if we looked before the Great Recession, we would see that 40% of the market for years was the typical share of first time home buyers. So from the 1980s through the 1990s into the early 20 or 2000s, what we would see is that 40% of the market were first time buyers. And so seeing them at 24% is very striking. It's very low. The other problem is, though, when we look at first time home buyers, it's not just the low share. It's also that the age is the highest we've ever seen it. They're now 38 years old as a median for first time home buyers. We
Wow.
used to see, yeah, 40 years ago, that the typical age of a first time home buyer was 28. So we're just thinking about someone who has to save for a longer period of time, who's grappling with higher rents, who may have student loan debt or childcare costs or any of the other factors that plague us all, like car loans and credit card debt. And they're trying to save for a down payment. And that just goes to the back burner because they're trying to really get their feet under them and everything else.
Yeah, I'm just like, I actually bought my first house at about 26 and I'm 39 now. And I'm just thinking about the difference in job position and maturity, frankly, between the
Right.
two. And that's a striking difference in those 10 years.
Absolutely. And there's some huge implications for realtors out there and for the housing market. If we think about someone who's 38 years old, you're probably pretty set in your career. You're probably pretty set in your family life at that point. Either you're partnered or not. You may have kids in tow at that point. So perhaps you're looking for the single family home in the burbs. And that's what we know these first time buyers are doing versus a smaller condo in a city center, because that's not going to work for you anymore at 38. We also know another big implication is you were lucky enough to earn that housing equity over that time frame. And these young adults, as they enter in 10 years later, just aren't. They're losing out on 10 years of housing equity gains, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've already bought my second purchase and I'm coming up on my third just in the
Yeah.
time I've had that. So, and then the second purchase we have actually kept as a rental back in Albuquerque.
Right.
Um, but
Wonderful.
yeah, yeah, which is great, but it's also kind of the problem is, I have a 3% mortgage on that house. And
Yeah, why would you let that go?
exactly. I mean, if your mortgage is less than inflation, it's an asset. So, and that does contribute to, quite a lot of lock-in. Um,
Yes.
so let's go to the other side of the market is kind of your all cash buyers. You had mentioned earlier a lot of people have a lot of equity, and there's kind of another part of the market that's actually kind of doing pretty well right now. What do you have on them?
Oh, it is. And we're really seeing this tale of two cities when we look at the housing market today. We know that more than a quarter of the market from 2022 onwards has been paying cash for their homes. And these are primary residence buyers that are paying cash. It's absolutely striking when we see that nearly a third of repeat buyers in the market are paying cash. We know that it's largely dominated by baby boomers, half of older boomers, 40% of younger boomers. Um, we know, though, that 1 in 10 first time home buyers are paying cash too. So, using mom and dad's money and inheritance, the stock market. So, this is a different type of first time buyer who can get into this market. So, it's quite unusual, but it's driven by housing equity largely.
And I think I don't know, maybe it's a misnomer, maybe it isn't, but the thought is I was like, oh, it's all these California buyers coming in. Where are a lot of these cash buyers coming from? Is it really just like California, New York, Florida, or is it more across the board?
So it's all over. And I have the benefit of talking to realtors across the country, and it really feels like all over people are seeing these all cash buyers. And largely it is baby boomers who are in the market. They've been in their home for a long period of time. They're making a move now. And those moves are driven for lots of reasons, whether that's retirement or to be close to the grandkid or just thinking about a luxury, amenity rich condo where they can age in place. Whatever that reason is, they're able to make this trade and do so with a very large down payment or an all cash purchase.
It's definitely that kind of that tale of two markets and the kind of divided market for sure. I one example that I've used a couple times was one that we found that was two sales 4 years apart. But both of them sold for 200K, but the one that sold for 200K in 2024 was one less bedroom, one less bathroom, 30% less square foot, 30% less acreage, no garage, no back deck. Um, and they're the if you do the math based on mortgages then and mortgages now, it'd be $371 a month higher for
Yeah.
that house in 2024. Um, So that's definitely having a constraint on inventory. But like you said, there's those life things still happen.
They
So
do. They
that's
do.
where we're seeing some of an increase in inventory.
Yeah, absolutely. Are really those life changes are propelling that, but we also know that baby boomers are too. So it's both demographics, but it's also just looking at life changes happening, and that's what's making some move. But yes, that lock-in effect, and many homeowners are doing that math and saying, does the math work out? I'm going to have a different interest rate. And I think one of the factors they need to put into it, though, is that housing equity that they've been earning. Because if we look at the typical homeowner across the nation and how much housing equity that they have had, how much price appreciation they have had in the last 5 years since 2020, we just do 2020 to this last month, what we can see is the typical homeowner has gained 49%.
Wow.
And yeah, so they're sitting on a ton of wealth, but it's in their home. And so if they made that move, they're really buying down that rate if they really use that equity. And I think a lot of people are not necessarily aware of that housing equity, and they might actually be in a home that's not working for them.
That's very true. And I know another thing, and this is much more long term than economists usually like to think in. But I know we're looking at kind of this great wealth transfer kind of coming up with the boomer generation. Yeah, any prognostications on what that could mean for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think this is a really important one when we look at the housing market today. When we look at first-time home buyers and where they scrape together their down payment, I mentioned that it's their 401k, it's a gift or a loan from mom and dad or friends or family broadly. But we also know it's the highest share of first-time home buyers in the last year who actually used an inheritance for their down payment, and that's 7%. And so that's quite high, actually. That's the highest we've ever recorded. And if we continue to see that growing, we are going to see that generational transfer of wealth. And a lot of economists out there have called it a silver tsunami. I think it's a trickle at this point. It's a little river, it's a little stream, but we're not necessarily seeing this huge transfer of wealth. It's not a tsunami at this point, but we will start to see that in the housing market. And that is going to impact the housing market as well.
And actually, I want to take a pause here for a second. We've thrown a lot of numbers at people. So just in case anybody's out there furiously writing all these down, majority of all these stats are going to be in the home buyers and sellers report, right?
Yeah, it's so I'm citing a lot of stats. I would definitely do a massive plug here. If you're not following us on social media, NAR Research has its own feeds. So there's the main NAR feeds that you probably are following, but the NAR Research ones are really great. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn, we're on X. So you can find us and you can find all these infographics that talk about these different topics, blog post links, a ton of information that's for you if you don't want to dig into the report. But yes, the profile of home buyers and sellers is a fantastic report for you to grab too as a resource, and it's available for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always one of the reports I look forward to the most every year because especially these stats, like especially the one with the 24% first time home buyers and the nearly third that are all cash. Like this is useful information for any realtor to have to be the market expert they're expected to be. So I really cannot stress enough that people need to take advantage of that benefit from NAR.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this is here for you. So we have a ton of information that's on our website, and I know it's hard to dig into. So grabbing it on social media and saying, oh, that's pretty interesting, you can find those links for that information too.
Awesome. So yeah, so let's dig back in. One of the things, just anecdotally, talking to realtors kind of on the street, people kind of feel like we're heading towards a buyer's market. Some of the indicators are somewhat there, but what do you think? Are we really heading that direction?
I think it really depends. It depends on the price point of the home. It depends on that local market. And so if your realtors are feeling it in some of their local niches, then that is possible for them, but it's not true necessarily everywhere nationwide. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of inventory coming in at certain price points and maybe not enough buyers at those price points, but at other ones we know that we really don't have enough inventory and there's plenty of buyers. So it really depends on where you are. The other thing that's pretty interesting is if we compare this spring market to last year's spring market, we know it's subdued. We know that there's fewer multiple offers, but we're still seeing some multiple offers on homes.
Hmm.
We're still seeing all cash purchases. And so it really depends on which local market you're talking about and what local price point that you're talking about too.
Yeah, and when you say local, you don't just mean geographically. Like it's going back to the tale of two markets. In our area, you're above median up to luxury is like days on market's going 60, 90 days at this point, but your below median sale price is still hopping. We're still seeing quite a few multiple offer homes in those situations. So it's kind of that same tale of two markets thing you were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. And you personally, as a realtor, will know what that hot market is. You'll know that zip code that everyone wants to get into, that perfect school district that families want to move to, or that first time home buyers or those retirees are really struggling to get into. You know which market that is. And you know if you get a prize home in that area, that there's going to be a lot of demand. But you also know if you move over a zip code, that there could be a lot less demand for a home that's similarly priced. So it really does depend. It comes down to location, it comes down to price, and it comes down to your local demand, which is going to be different everywhere.
And I love that. One of the things I say all the time is like I'm a nerd. I love technology. I love statistics, but it doesn't really matter what us nerds do. Nothing beats the feet on the street, right?
Right.
Like we can arm people with this knowledge, but this knowledge can't really tell you exactly how Ashland Park is doing the way a realtor can. Which is why people are there is ChatGPT and AI is going to replace everybody. No, absolutely not. Because you really just cannot beat that local knowledge.
Oh, no, absolutely. And we know that buyers and sellers are going to search for things on the internet. They're going to search for homes, but they can't necessarily get that direct answer about their transaction and their personal situation from Google. So they're going to be calling you, they're going to be asking you those questions, and hopefully it's not at all hours of the night, but I know it is for y'all. So just making sure that you are that local expert. That's what buyers and sellers are looking for. They're looking for that local expertise when they find someone to work with.
Absolutely. So let's see what else we have here. All right, so we talked a lot about a lot of the different tools that NAR has. What else is out there that members have access to, or they can kind of pull some of the stuff themselves?
Yeah, so as you become that local expert and you are that local expert, RPR is one of those tools too, that's out there that you can plug in your very local stats and you can find up to the minute market data. So if you're not using that tool, that's a great one. I've talked a lot about seniors too, and one of the things that they built into the RPR tool recently is an ARP livability index. So if you're working with a senior buyer and they're like, I don't know, is this going to be good to age in place? Or they're never going to talk about aging. They're just going to say, is this going to be good to live here for 20 years? And you're looking at them and you're thinking, oh, you're 85. Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that. Then maybe looking at some of the ARP livability index that's built into RPR is a good way. The other two things that I'm going to plug too is that at NAR Research, we've actually created two local dashboards that you can play around with your job market. You can play around with GDP. You can play around with who the demographics of buyers are and local affordability, housing equity gains. And the housing equity gains tool that we have for local markets, I think is really cool because it goes, they've lived in their home for 1 year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5, so on. And so if you know that you've worked with someone 5 years ago, shooting them an email and saying, did you know that the typical home in your area has gained this much? And you personally, based on my assessment, have gained XYZ. I think that that's a really good reach out to folks too. And those tools are all available for you guys to use.
Yeah, and that equity, like you had mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't realize what they have. And
No.
kind of the way I've described it to people is, okay, so I got into the market at a really great time with my first house. And what's been interesting about it is I've kind of moved with it. Like as rates have gone up, my so has my equity that I was able to put in the second home. And then, now that second home I'm keeping, but honestly, if I wanted to sell it, I would have equity that would help me with the third one.
Hmm.
So once you're in, that equity can kind of help you offset those changes. And most, I don't say, I'm not gonna say most, but many people don't even know what they have. Same thing with like renters. I've heard that there's a lot of renters who probably could afford to buy maybe for less than they're renting. They just don't really realize it.
I love that you just brought that up because today we actually released a down payment blog and an infographic that's accompanying it as well. Because I think a lot of folks are getting their advice that they need 20% down. And yes, there's PMI, but I think there's a lot of people who don't realize that there's VA loans or FHA loans or Freddie or Fannie. and that the typical first time home buyer, they only put down 9% last year. So they're aware of it because they're not putting down 20%. And so educating folks on these things can be really helpful. I also heard this anecdotal story from realtors too. This is painful, but I heard that they've worked with first time buyers during the pandemic years where parents perhaps wanted to get their kid into home ownership and they got them into home ownership. They've locked in low interest rate mortgages. And now they literally have no financial literacy, that they are paying a mortgage and they are earning housing equity. And they don't realize that they can move because they think that they have to be there for 30 years. And so those kinds of reach outs to young adults, I think could be really helpful in this type of housing market.
Yeah, I think that's really good just to kind of talk about like generationally. I think one of the things we see, and this is like I am a millennial, so I'm talking about millennials as a millennial, is that my generation tends to want the well, I'll call it handholding a little bit more, where we're going to trust that professional a little more than even previous generations have, and I think you're seeing that with Gen Z as well, where they really want that guidance on utilities, inspections, negotiations, like all these different things. And I think that's also why we've actually seen the number of people using agents increase over the years.
Mhm. I agree with that completely, and also as a millennial, but I also think that we use technology so much as a place to say, "Oh, does this place actually have good coffee?" And if we're doing that for good coffee, we need someone for the biggest transaction in our life to walk us through that process and tell us what is next, to tell us how do I go about this. And you need that human contact to be able to do that. And I think this is one of the reasons too, if you go into like really nice clothing stores now, it seems to be that there's more people willing to help you than there was a decade ago. And I'm wondering if this is part of it, is that people want that hand holding. They want the Instagram influencer to tell them something, but they also need that personal recommendation, that personal advice.
It's so interesting looking at the macro cycles of humanity, isn't it? Like,
Mhm.
it was for first we had big phones, and we got to tiny phones, and we went back to big phones, and and now it's okay. Then we had big box, or I'm sorry, we had like individual stores, and then we went to big box stores, and then we went to online, and now you're going back to the individual stores. It's
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
just it's so
Boutique.
it's so funny to just watch the cycles of humanity and the way it works.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so let's turn to this is kind of the tough topic, and circling back to that affordable housing. Like,
Mhm.
um, I hear it from politicians. Like, how do we fix this? Politicians are like, why don't realtors give us like the one silver bullet that's just going to fix all the problems? And as you're probably going to back me up on, it's not that easy. There's a lot of different solutions that have to happen, but what policies or incentives do you think are the most important?
Oh goodness. I don't think there is one solution. I will say that. And I think you're absolutely right in saying that there's lots of questions of how to fix this, but I think there's also lots of answers. So in some communities, we have density restrictions, so not allowing building of 2 to 4 units in what could be zoned as just a single family property. In other communities, there's really silly laws on the books saying you have to plant these many shrubs and these many trees before you can have a place here, or this many parking spots. And perhaps it's a 1 bedroom studio type place, and you suddenly need 2 parking spots. It makes absolutely no sense. In other communities, I think that there are ways to bring more housing in, such as adaptive reuse. So, thinking about vacant hotel motels, vacant schools, even vacant nursing homes or residential malls. And that could be a way to bring in residential units that has been successful in other communities. And so I think broadening the types of things that we're looking at, and even labor constraints. So, really encouraging young adults to look at the trades as an attractive career option as
Mhm.
opposed to perhaps college. That could be a really solid option for someone to try out, and also could bring in one of the really big issues that we have in building, which is the lack of skilled labor.
Yeah, the Dr. Clark on our last episode, we had a long conversation about labor and the issues around that. So people can reference our last podcast and hear more about that one. And also like zoning. That's one that I have some personal experience with. I was actually on a planning and zoning committee for a city, which if anybody's ever hasn't ever done that, I it's an eye-opening experience. We one time they had a law where the house could only be it had to be a minimum of 100 foot deep, and they had run into some issues, and they wanted to update that zoning regulation to say it had to be 100 foot deep and wide. And it was for completely innocuous reasons. It was like, well, we just don't want somebody able to just like turn the house, and then it's breaking the rule we have in place. But I was like, well, hold on a second, guys. If you pass this, what you're actually saying is that every single building built in this city has to be at least 1,000 square foot.
Wow.
And once they realized that, they were like, oh, wow, we hadn't really thought about that. And I was like, yeah, you're taking out trailers, you're taking out tiny homes,
Right.
you're taking out, there's tons of new affordable housing options out there that you're just murdering.
Right.
And they didn't realize that. And I don't think they were trying to do anything wrong, but, I think that's a bit of a plug for, all the realtors out there who are on these planning and zoning committees, kind of keeping an eye on stuff like that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And we know that folks generally are not super engaged to go in there. And the folks who do attend those meetings often are folks who say NIMBYism is great, not in my backyard. I don't want this. Well, it turns out that there's a community around you of folks who are really demanding housing. And so showing up at those meetings, participating in local government can be a really great way to really break through this.
It really is, and as somebody who was on one of those, it is painful. I'm not gonna lie, but it is such an important impact. And frankly, I've seen realtors be very successful by being visible at those things too. So there's a bit of a business impact there as well. So there's a lot of different things that policymakers and politicians have to balance. So they have to balance, rate guidance, inventory policy, housing equity concerns. Like, what are some of the ways that we can when we're going into these rooms of politicians, we're talking to them. What are some of the ways we can help them balance that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really impactful when you're talking to policymakers is looking at the economic impact of a home sale in your local community. And the reason why I say that is that real estate is actually nearly 20% of the US economy, but in every single state, it's slightly different. And so if you go in there with data like that, that shows that, hey, for every home that's actually sold in this community, we're adding this much into our local GDP because it's a huge multiplier effect. And we know that people need a place to live, but also they want to furnish their home and they're going to use title and they're going to use appraisers and they're going to use insurers and so on and so on. And that impacts so many careers. I think that's a really impactful data point that you can be fueled with to go in with.
Yeah, that's the economic impact of a typical home sale is something that NAR updates once a year, right?
We do.
And the one for Kentucky, I went and pulled it up while you were talking about it. There is $91,400 per home sold. So about just under 25,000 of that is income generated from real estate. 5,600 expenditures related to the purchase. Almost $15,000 on the multiplier of related expenditures, and then 46,000 from new home construction. So that is an absolute stellar thing that NAR puts out every year that I love carrying with me into these meetings.
Yeah, and that's incredibly impactful. If you tell that to local folks who are really making these housing decisions, it's not only workforce housing, it's not only where are folks going to live in my local community, but how much economically are you actually adding? It's a ton. And so going in with those tools, I think can start making differences in local communities.
Yeah, and another tool from NAR. We mentioned RPR earlier, but they have like the demographics and market stats kind of reports as well that we've also carried in with policymakers. So, just another way that NAR really leans on and helps out with advocacy.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. We love our folks in advocacy. They are always tapping us for information. We are trying as quickly and furiously as possible to make sure that they have all that information and tools to use.
Absolutely. So, as we start to kind of wind down here, what are some of the key indicators you're going to be watching in the next 6 to 12 months for market stabilization or shifts?
Well, certainly we're going to be watching interest rates. That's a big one. If we see interest rates drop a little bit, that's certainly going to fuel a lot more activity in the housing market. The two other measures that I'm really keeping an eye on too are those first time home buyers. If we see any movement in that, North, that's really what we want to see is more young adults coming into the market, fueling the market. And also those all cash buyers. There's a lot of cash in this housing market. It's very unusual. If we look pre-pandemic, it'd be 15%. So seeing it more than a quarter of the market for years now is quite unusual post-pandemic. So taking a look at those three figures, I think will give us a lot of information.
Very good. Yeah, I appreciate that. So just one last, like, is there any other cool stat that we haven't brought up that I'm missing that you're just itching to get out there for us?
Oh my goodness. I I am the nerdiest person to ask that. One cool stat. Did y'all know that 16% of home buyers choose their home and factor in their home, wait for it, drum roll, because of their pet? I kid you not. They are factoring in their home buying decisions because of their pet. And I know you've worked with a client like that because we see it in the data. They want a home that's big enough for their dog. They want a fenced yard. They want to choose a place that's good enough walking trails and that perfect dog park. So that's your fun fact from me.
Oh, wow, that's great. And you know what? I talk with realtors all the time about, find your niche in the market. Maybe the next person needs to be like, I'm the dog lover realtor, and,
There you go. Why not?
just go for it, man. Like one very successful realtor, one of my previous associations is the sportsman's realtor. So, I mean, find your niche and go after it, man. It's that works. And that stat I know came also from that home buyers and sellers report, right?
We do. Yeah. And we have an infographic for it. So if you're thinking that that's your niche, or you're thinking, ooh, I need to educate people on those low down payment programs, we have infographics on all of our social media platforms that you can grab and share with your clients.
Yeah, I know we beat it up. I'm going to give it one last plug, that home buyers and sellers report. The way I describe it to people is that NAR surveys a bunch of people who either recently bought or sold a home to ask them about what they thought of and in the process. And quite frankly, I think that's information that every realtor should want to know, because you're getting direct feedback from consumers about what was important to them. What tools did they use? How did they interact in the transaction? All these kind of things. There's always that joke that, 50% of my marketing spend isn't working. I just don't know which half. But if you're looking at something like the buyers and sellers report, it can help you target that and make a real impact on your business day to day.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do, is just give that into your hands so you can use that truly as a tool in the market.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Dr. Lautz, for being on the podcast with us. Everybody, thanks for listening to the What's the Deal podcast. We'll have another one out for you next month. So subscribe, stay tuned, and we'll see you next month. That wraps up this episode of What's the Deal. We'll see you next time for more tips and updates from your trusted real estate source. Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an update, and catch us on social media on all the major platforms. If you have any real estate questions, feel free to reach out, and thanks for listening.